Minute. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning, everybody. I see we have a visitor, Betsy. Welcome. Welcome to Bible Study Adult Forum. And then Evan, who is on our staff. I think this is your first time. I think I heard you say first time coming. Although you'll be teaching, I guess, next week. So good to see you. I'd like to start with this particular song, and I'd like for us to maybe say it in unison. Psalm 121. I don't know. I guess Christian and Nelson, you can see that
Yes.
on the screen. But I thought we'd start reciting the song together, and then I will offer a prayer, and then we will start our lesson. So let's read together Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where
will my help come?
my
Help comes from the Lord,
who
who
made
made heaven and earth.
He
He
will
will not let your foot be moved.
He
He who keeps you will not slumber.
He
He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is the shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on forevermore.
Amen. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the promise of your word that you will be with us from now and forevermore. Now, as we begin our lesson, help us to hear what you would have us to hear. Help us to see what you would have us to see, so that we may do what you would have us to do. Pray for those who are in this room and on Zoom, and for those who are on their way. Thank you for who you are and your presence in our lives. Pray this prayer in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Yeah.
All right, I'll probably go up and down, and my helper will probably going crazy about what I'm trying to do. But in any event, I wanted to talk a little bit about, some of you who were already here last week have an idea about, I'll have to give Jack Steele the credit for our summer study. Some of you who are familiar with where we are in the congregation in terms of transition, and the leaders, I guess shortly after I started as the interim, the leaders did a book study, a 4-week book study on a book called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. How to lead in a liminal season, how to lead in a liminal season. And so last week, I'm sure Jack and Fran, as they led, talked a little bit about what liminal means. So I want to talk about that. But because of the leader study, when we started talking about what to do for this summer, typically, if those of you who've been around, you know that for the last several summers, we have focused on a book of the Bible. I think last summer, we journeyed through the book of 1 Corinthians. The summer before that, I think it was Acts. And then I think the summer before that, we did the so-called minor prophets. So this summer, as Jack and Fran, who head up the education committee, and some of the rest of you are on that committee, because the congregation is in a leadership transition, and because the leaders had read the book together on how to lead when you don't know where you're going, we decided that that our summer study would look at liminality in the Bible, because there are a lot of stories about people being in between. Oh, you have to move to the next one. There are many people in the Bible, many characters in the Bible, many situations in the Bible where we have this issue of liminality. So I'm sure Jack and Fran talked about the definition of liminality, but I thought I'd go over it again. And so you see the definition here on the board. What is liminality? Liminality refers to a quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs during transition when a person or group of people is in between something that has ended and something else that is not yet ready to begin. Transition experiences follow a predictable pattern that involves separation, liminality, and reorientation. And that's Susan Beaumont, the author of the book, from the book, How to Leave When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And so I've added another quote here, another thought here that's in the book. The words liminal and liminality are both derived from the Latin limen, and those of you who are I didn't take Latin, so if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, please correct me. Limen, meaning threshold, that is the bottom part of a doorway that must be crossed when entering a building. In Latin, limen referred to the stone placed on the threshold of a door that physically had to be mounted to cross from one place into another. So I'm going to stop there because now this is your second week of hearing this definition, probably, if you were here last week. I wanted to, what does that mean to you when you think about liminality, you think about this definition, and think about, as I put here in the bullet, looking to the future and looking to the past, or the already and the not yet? What comes to your mind based on these definitions? What comes to your mind when you think about transition and in between? Anybody? Get the visitor speaking up first. Good one.
For the people online, will you?
Oh,
Welcome,
should I sit down or stand up or anything?
You can sit down.
Yeah,
Sit down.
this is Betsy.
Hi, I'm Betsy, and I read this in the computer, and I couldn't believe it because I made a decision to move to North Carolina from New York in February, and as fast as I could, and I got here May 24th, and I was so excited, and I deconstructed my life of 74 years in New York where I was born. And I got here and I never realized that I was going to have to then construct a life going forward. So I'm right in this spot, I mean, in my own life, and having to have patience and realize, my future in Durham has not started yet.
You're in
But that's
between.
okay.
You're in between.
I'm looking for all the good things around me, the same bushes, the same birds and good things. So, but this really is interesting because it
That's great.
really relates to me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a great way of putting it. And we're going to talk about what does one do in the in-between season? We're going to explore that with the life of Joseph today in the Bible. Anybody else? How does liminality, how does this transition period resonate with you?
To me,
And she's speaking.
Melody, and then we'll come back over here, Linda.
I think about the journey and just making sure you are focused on the journey, not missing what you're supposed to learn along the way. We get so focused on the goal that sometimes we miss the journey as we're going. So making sure that we're being present.
Being present, trying to figure out what's happening in the journey in the in-between time, as opposed to focusing so much, I think I'm hearing you say, on the destination, on the outcome. As Betsy was saying, focusing so much on what can I find in Durham necessarily, as opposed to the journey to getting to learn what's in Durham. Craig.
Yeah, two things. One, the psalm that you had up earlier, sorry I was late, but that was at my wedding. That was read at my wedding. And then you have the threshold where there's the tradition of, stepping up the threshold, that sort of thing. So it was just making me think about, when getting married and, that transition of figuring out new things. But what I also thought about is tomorrow I'm having a team meeting with my team is going from 3 people to 7 people. I have 4 people who haven't been on my team before at work. And thinking about my role is mostly to try to make them feel comfortable and be aware of they're going through a transition. They have probably even less to know what to expect than I do, because I'm in the privileged position of leading, and at times I'll have to make decisions on their behalf. And so I'm sure they're wondering what to do. And I have to think about how to help them feel comfortable and help them feel included.
How to leave when they don't know where they're going.
Right.
Anybody else? Linda, I thought, did you ever hear that?
I didn't. I just making sure you didn't miss Craig.
He was advocating for me.
Anybody else?
I could share, what stood out a little was that reorientation.
Michelle, how are you?
Yeah. I'm doing pretty good. I got in from a run, so I'm gonna need to depart and then we'll do our
Okay.
our drive with the Zoom, but I wanted to be part of the class as much as I could this morning. So what stood out is because moving from Durham, it's not just a physical experience. Sometimes there's the physical transitions of liminality. There's the roles like Craig alluded, or marriage or job, but also the reorientation really dawned on me. The separation can also include like a disorientation.
Absolutely.
I mean, just like, where's the local store here? Where to run? What? Just that
Betsy, you're nodding your head. You're experiencing some of that disorientation. Betsy is a new person in our class, Amy. That's, I don't know if you probably can't see her, but.
I can't see her yet, but I'll look forward to meeting her hopefully soon.
Yeah. Yeah. So continue that disorientation. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, it's as simple as you need to buy an item of clothes. And before I lived 2 miles off Fayetteville Road in Durham, a townhouse right near South Square Mall. I knew exactly where the stores were, exactly where the da. And you're here and you're like, okay, I don't even know where my favorite, place is. I mean, that's rather simple, but
that's a good example. And Melody here had talked about focusing on the journey in between. Not so much kind of finding what you need, but what do you need to learn in that disorienting space, I guess, is one of the questions that we're going to deal with.
Yeah, and I would concur that Miguel, I said, let's try and not change too many factors let's keep grounding in the word, or keep going to Duke Chapel, even if we're exhausted doing something with the house. That's looking for at least a few things that are still the same that help in the reorienting process. So.
Right, that's great. This looking into the future and to the past is kind of a grounding. And then the already and the not yet, already and the not yet. So let's go to the next slide.
You've got control, yeah.
Okay, I can control, thank you. And so a couple other quotes I want us to focus on before we get to talking about Joseph. I want us to hone in on this. So, and you've kind of hit on some of this already. All transformation takes place here, meaning here in this period of liminality. We have to allow ourselves to be drawn out of, quote, business as usual, and remain patiently, somebody already used that word patient, I think Betsy, you did, patiently, on the threshold where we are betwixt and between the familiar and the completely unknown. It's the realm where God can best get at us because our false certitudes are finally out of the way. This is the sacred space where the old world is able to fall apart and a bigger world is revealed. If we don't encounter liminal space in our lives, we start idealizing normalcy. And the underlines are my emphasis. We don't encounter liminal space in our lives. We start idealizing normalcy. The threshold is God's waiting room. Here we are taught openness and patience as we come to expect an appointment with the divine doctor. And that quote, and it's in the book from Richard Rohr. You're probably familiar with Richard Rohr. And it's from his book, Everything Belongs, The Gift of Contemplative Prayer. So let's talk a little bit about this. This is kind of building upon our understanding of liminality. So what do you think about this notion of what Rohr says? It's allowing ourselves to be drawn out of business as usual. This whole notion of being patient. It's the realm where God can best get at us because our false certitudes are finally out of the way. And sometimes we don't believe that because we like certitude, we like certainty. But But talk about what Roar is talking about here, this getting away from this expectation or idealizing, as he said, idealizing normalcy. And we've alluded to this already, but I want to hear some other people who might, this quote might resonate with you. Betsy again.
I'm very loud. I don't know if I.
We like loud, we like loud.
Pass the mic.
No, the mic is good, the mic is really.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay. You know, this reminds me of the idea of this, of a seed that has to crack. It just reminds me a lot of other crack in order to send out a root. If the seed is intact, shiny and perfect, it's not cracked open, it's not gonna grow a plant. And then the other idea that I've heard that, you know, God or the light or, you know, positive spiritual growth that often comes into the broken places. So that if, that's how, where the light gets in, that kind of, you know, metaphor.
Mhm. Henry, I think you had your mic.
Yeah, so when you were asking what liminality means to us, I was thinking but didn't speak. Everybody else had a lot of good comments, but then when I read that statement there, it says, here we are taught openness and patience as we come to expect an appointment with the divine doctor. So, I mean, for me, here I am 77 years old and I'm moved here relatively recently. So I'm kind of in limbo. That's another word, by the way, limbo, that seems somewhat close to liminality. But, you know, my transition is thinking about my life and how I want to live the last years of my life, thinking about meeting my divine doctor. So it's a little bit different.
What have you thought about? It's Melody had us think about the journey. Have you thought about what lessons you want to learn in the journey in this liminal space?
Well, I guess part of it is reflecting on my own life and what's been good about it and what I can take a real sense of satisfaction from. And then part of it is how do I want to use the time that I have now that I have a lot of freedom and flexibility over how I can spend my time. So that's a continuing quest for me that I think about every day.
Anybody else? Can I see, you're holding the mic? Oh, you're just holding the mic. Barbara.
I was
That's good.
thinking about, the part that strikes me a little bit is this, idealizing normalcy. And then, now as Henry is referring to, at this, season of life, it's easy not to reflect in what has been, productive and valuable, in work. And in what ways was I starting to idealize that as the way it should be or something? Whereas in this liminal space, I can break out of that and think about what is where God can best get at me. Are finally out of the way, maybe.
That's a good point. Sometimes in this season, I'm in that season too. Just figure you're just gonna float on out and things will be the same. As opposed to being open to perhaps God doing a new thing. Even in a later season in life. I think that's what I'm hearing you say. Even in a later season of life, still those false certitudes that we come to rely upon can still get out of the way because God can do a new thing. Melody.
Wanted to go along with that and what you're saying, the first thing that came to my mind was when we get too complacent, we tend to think that things going on in our life is because of something we've done and not from something God has done. And so I think these moments come up for God, you know, to continually be able to teach us and show us, you know, that we do need to grow, as she was saying, with the seed was a great analogy. But just to kind of go off what you were saying.
Good. That's a good segue for us to talk about, well, one other set of quotes. And this is, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Susan Beaumont talks about in the book about how the Judeo-Christian story is filled with liminal experiences, and we're going to see that throughout the study this summer. Liminal seasons, as we've talked about, are challenging, disorienting. I think Amy used the word disorienting and unsettling. But this notion, and I highlighted this, God's greatest work occurs in the liminal space. So I want us to keep that in mind as we talk about the life of Joseph. These are some questions that I want us to explore for the next 30 minutes or so as we talk about the life of Joseph. But just to just get a baseline to see where we are. Who is Joseph? I mean, those of you who've been in Sunday school and Bible study for a long time, I'm sure the Joseph story is a popular story. So I'm just kind of asking generally what you know about Joseph in the Old Genesis.
Musical.
Well, what you learn from the musical? The coat of many colors.
Yeah, that's right.
We know that. Okay, coat of many colors is one thing we know about Joseph. What else do we know about him?
I hate to be such a, I don't know. The Hebrew, the coat of many colors is an invention of some,
Killing it here.
Right.
yeah,
Christian is our biblical.
the actual term in the Hebrew is a robe with long sleeves.
Yes. Yes.
Coat of many colors. The King James translators made it much more fanciful and pretty, I guess.
Well, and it was easy for a musical, and it was easy for a children's Bible story, but I appreciate
Yeah.
those of you who don't know Christian, you know, as a biblical scholar. So thank you for helping us with that. But we're starting with what you know, and so maybe what we know is not necessarily correct, but that does help. Henry.
Joseph was the favored son in a family that had quite a few sons.
Yeah, specifically Joseph was a son of Rachel, who was the favored wife of the two wives of Jacob. The other,
Do you know who the other? Not you, Christian. Do you know who the other wife is?
Leah.
I know you know. I said Christian. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I said not Christian.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm trying to do a test in the room. So
Okay.
so Leah and Rachel, and you're right. Rachel was the favorite wife. If you remember that story, back in Genesis to get the most of the story. But yes, Rachel was the favorite wife, and Rachel had two sons, Joseph and what? Another test.
Benjamin was, when the Joseph story begins, Benjamin is not yet born.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And if you want to do a real quiz, ask somebody, see who can name the other 10 sons. But don't,
Can
anyway.
anybody name the other 10 sons? It's like a real bonus. I'll bring you a donut next week, or Evan. Next week.
The tribe, the name for the tribe. You said two of them.
Gad, Benjamin.
I might get them all eventually, but
Anybody else?
Zebulun, and
Judah, Reuben. Yeah, because some of these up here, we're gonna open our Bibles here in a minute. Anything else, Christian, we need to add about Joseph before we move on? Christian is my friend, you can tell.
he was favored by his father Jacob because he was son of Rachel, which made his 10 brothers who were sons of Leah jealous of him.
Okay, so we're going to, thank you, that's helpful as we're going, because you see the questions I have here. Who is Joseph? And we touched a little bit on that. What happened to him? What happened in his liminal period? What lessons can we learn from his period of liminality? And what does faith have to do with this story? The Jack's idea about this title of this series is called Faith on the Threshold. I think it is Faith on the Threshold. So we want to bring in the faith story, the faith world, walk, as we think about lessons that we learned from the Joseph story. So let's get out our Bibles. I'd like for someone to start with Genesis 37, verses 1 through 8, and another person to read that same chapter, but verses 19 through 28. This is kind of a bit of a review. So Genesis 37, verses 1 through 8, and then Genesis 37, verses 19 through 28. Any volunteers? Evan? Okay. We may need the microphone.
Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, Israel had loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age. He had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words.
Okay, did you all know that part of the Joseph story?
Mhm.
Okay. Is that in a musical,
Yeah.
correct? That part was in a musical?
it is.
Yeah. Okay. And then let's go to I've tried to pick out verses to give us a better sense of the story. So verses 19 in that same chapter, verses 19 through 28, if someone will read. Anybody can.
Seven 19. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his life? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. That gives you a good background about what actually happened to Joseph. Any thoughts about that? Is this
I just
information
want to
that you-
correct, I
Yes, go
want
ahead, Christian. Go ahead.
to correct something I said earlier, that not all the other sons were by Leah. I think two of them, the servant women who were mentioned, Bilhah and Zilpah. I think Bilhah would not be a name I would want for my daughter, but anyway, each of those women had two of Jacob's children, Joseph's brothers.
So I'm pulling out just some highlights, so we'll get a sense of Joseph's liminal period. So I'm moving us over to chapter 39 in Genesis, 39 verses 1 through 6. I'm a Baptist, so we like to read out. So anybody else, chapter 39, Genesis verses 1 through 6?
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, but the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance.
Okay, that's a good place to start. And few other verses, and then we're going to talk about Joseph's liminal period. So those 4 verses, verses 19 through 23 in that same chapter. Can I get a reader, please? Starting at verse 19. Any other? Ken is looking around for other volunteers. This is Bob's study. Evan said he'll read.
When his master heard the words of that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he, Potiphar, became enraged, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper.
Okay. So talk to me about Joseph's. I mean, we're beginning. He's in his liminal. I'm suggesting he's in his liminal period now. What stands out to you? And one thing I really want us to hone in on, particularly in that chapter 39 verses 21 and 23. I want you to look at those particular verses, but talk generally about what do we see in Joseph's liminal period? What's going on here? Anything that stands out to you?
I think we could make an argument about when the liminal period begins and ends. That's really another discussion, but as we've seen, Joseph is greatly gifted, but those gifts inspire jealousy and all sorts of other complex dynamics that make this little period a very difficult period. Despite the fact that Joseph is maturing and increasing his influence by the day.
And in terms of age, and I didn't read all the verses, but in age, he's somewhere in the teenage 17, 18, 19, and earlier. That's where Joseph is in terms of age, correct?
We don't hear anything in the text about how Joseph is feeling about this separation. It's left to the reader that, well, there's been kind of a big deal that's happened here. And yet we don't hear Joseph really remorseful or not really, that's the wrong word, but looking back. He seems to be just taking it in stride somehow, despite his age, as you were saying.
So he goes to Potiphar's house. Potiphar shows him favor. He runs into an issue with Mrs. Potiphar. And then he is thrown in jail. But even in jail, he seems to get favor, enjoy favor even with the jailer. And so that's why I wanted us to look at verses 2:21 and 23. What do you see in those verses? Chapter 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. So the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 21 says something similar. But the Lord was with Joseph. This is after he's in jail, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And then verse 23, the chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Why do you think I picked those verses out? Why do you think that's important, Betsy?
Well, I feel that it seems like a lot of the credit, it's not really Joseph, but God keeps God has first of all given him all these gifts, made him very handsome, made him very, appealing to other people who seem to, have faith in him, even though he hasn't really done anything. And then God seems to intervene again and again on his behalf. So I don't know how much credit Joseph isn't giving up. He's got resilience, but it seems that God is doing, now granted, some of these gifts made his life more difficult, but it seems that God is doing it all to a certain extent.
Good. And I'm going back to something that Craig said, and you're right, the text doesn't say this explicitly, but remember we started off talking about Joseph's relationship with his brothers and Joseph telling his brothers the dream that the stalks of corn were going to stand up and he was going to be over them. So implicit in his telling the dream and the brothers selling him off, do you think that perhaps, although the text is not necessarily explicit here, later, you have to go later in Genesis at the end of the Joseph story to hear some of that, I think. But is the implication that perhaps Joseph, having been sold off by his brothers, having been falsely accused by Mrs. Potiphar, and now in jail, that we could perhaps think that he's been more humble because of his situation? Perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess jail and being falsely accused will kind of do that. But Betsy raises a point about God. Where's God in the story? And in this text, the writer talks about God being with Joseph. Even in this liminal space, even in this difficult situation, God showed favor to Joseph. So what happened next? And we're not gonna, I guess I have one more little section I want us to read, and then we're gonna talk about what happens, because this is we could argue his period of disorientation. So chapter 40, and Evan, you probably just have it right there if you would read 40 verses 9 through 15. I'll read for you next week.
So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon."
Okay. All right, so what happened next? Christian, I'm gonna call on you because then you can summarize the story. So we found out about the cupbearer who was in jail. Joseph interpreted the dream of the cupbearer, and Joseph says to the cupbearer, when you get out of here, in essence, don't remember me. Remember me to Pharaoh. So what happened next? Christian, can you hear me? Maybe Christian can't. Everybody in here know what happened next? Oh,
Okay, I'm sorry, I was muted. Just one thing I would note, verse 12, this idea, the 3 branches being three days and a resurrection of sorts. And this is all over the Old Testament. You'll find lots and lots of places where there will be 3 days and something very positive happens. Well, in any case, after after the interpretation of the dreams, Joseph is sort of appointed Secretary of Agriculture, and by the Pharaoh is he saves up there's 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Joseph in his new responsibility saved up the 7-year grain for during the 7 years of plenty. During the 7 years of famine, the brothers are back in Israel and they're going hungry. They hear that there is food in Egypt. They go to Egypt where they encounter for the first time in many years their brother Joseph.
Okay, Christian, hold on, because you're getting ahead of our story. I really want us to focus
Okay, I'm
on,
sorry.
I know I did say summary, but I really want us to focus on what had to kind of hone in on cupbearer, interprets that dream, cupbearer gets out, goes back to being a cupbearer. But some time passes. I think it's 2 years. I think the text says 2 years pass. Cupbearer forgets Joseph, really. And so finally, Pharaoh has a dream. Nobody could interpret the dream. Then the cupbearer said, "Oh yeah, there's this guy I left in prison who interpreted my dream." They bring Joseph out. That's how, as Christian was saying, Joseph talks to Pharaoh, and he becomes, as Christian says, the Secretary of Agriculture, meaning that Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of saving, they knew a famine was coming, so saving the grain, saving the food, so that Egypt would have a repository of food. So I wanted us to look at that, because I think I think one could argue that this is the period of Joseph's reorientation. He had this period of disorientation, Potiphar's house, being sold by his brother, Potiphar's house, jail. So now he is kind of next to Pharaoh in terms of authority and significance. So I want us to think about, what does that mean? What are the lessons we've kind of honed in on some of these about God being with Joseph? We talked about Joseph's resilience. I mean, we think that Joseph was patient, although the text doesn't say that, but clearly there had to have been some issue around humility, having been kind of thrown in a pit and sold by his actual brothers. So what lessons, because I want us to kind of begin heading toward landing the plane here. What lessons do we learn from Joseph's liminal period, kind of this little part of the story? The story gets really good at the end, which is Christian was taking us to that. You can read that at home for your homework. But I wanted us to just focus in on this particular period, the being in the prison, getting out and becoming kind of second to Pharaoh and having authority. So what lessons can we see from Joseph's liminal period?
One thing that comes to my mind is it seems as though he's giving his best despite whatever situation he's in. Because he continues to be seen as that leader in that example.
That's great that even if he was in the pit, even if he's in Potiphar's house, he had favor because he still had a sense of excellence. Yeah, I like that. Anybody else? Betsy?
Well, I think that when he was in jail, when he was in the worst circumstances, he was still, kind and generous to the cupbearer, gave him his, best interpretation of his dream. So he didn't just sulk in the corner or get aggressive toward the other prisoners or, say, leave me alone. He actually tried to help the cupbearer by interpreting his dream. So when he was in the worst place, he, as she said, he still did his best, and he still kind of shone in the worst circumstances. He stayed in the present, as everybody says.
So in this liminal period, that was significant. Ken,
I wondered about how much Joseph put into place for himself this concept of there's a future here based on his dream with his brothers bowing down to him, that he would know by faith that God has an ultimate plan that's bigger than the mess that he's in right now.
that's great. So our faith, what you're saying, that there's this element of faith with Joseph, that notwithstanding what was happening with him, he believed that God would ultimately deliver. Is that what I'm hearing?
Deliver and even accomplish God's greater purpose.
Mhm. Exactly. One verse I didn't have you read, and I had to see exactly where it was, but when he talked to Pharaoh about the dream, he didn't talk about himself. He talked about God, that this was God's doing, that even Pharaoh, when Pharaoh picked him, if you go back and look at those verses, even Pharaoh said, I want you, Joseph, because God has already given you the answers to what we need. And so giving the credit to God, I think, is another point that I think we need to think about being in this liminal period. Anything else? And Betsy kind of alluded to this too earlier. I mean, what about God? What is God, and where's God in the story? There are references to God when Joseph talks to Pharaoh, but God in many ways, I think the Walter Brueggemann quote here, talks about kind of the hiddenness of God in the text. But he ends by saying, you see where I underline there, but the ways of God are nonetheless reliable and will come to fruition.
There's a verse that's Genesis 50, verse 20, that sort of sums that up. Joseph says to his brothers, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing so today.
Right, that's one of the key verses in the Joseph story. So I would encourage you to, as Christian is leading us to the end of the Joseph story, Genesis 50:20 is well known. When you go to the rest of the story, the brothers come. The brothers need food. They go to Egypt. They find out they don't know what happened to Joseph. Joseph is over everything. He looks different. It's a great story. But I really wanted us to focus on the liminal piece. Jack.
This is my favorite story of
all in the Old Testament, particularly because of that dramatic conclusion
Right.
that Kristen just gave us. But in calling it the Joseph story, we underplay the workings of God, because this is the story of God and God's purposes that God will work out despite whatever backdrops and very great difficulties that we put in God's way. God's purpose will win out in the end.
To read,
Right, Melody.
I just wanted to read a scripture that says exactly what Jack just said. This is chapter 41, verse 16. I think you may have been referring to it. When Pharaoh is asking Joseph about if he can interpret the dream, Joseph actually responds, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires.
Yeah,
That it's God.
exactly. That's what we're talking about God. So we need to wrap up. Any other closing thoughts about this story? I mean, we've had some great summaries, Jack, and good summary Melody just did as well. What can we learn? What does this mean? This is a wonderful story. What does it mean for us in the end? I'm going to ask Jack to close in prayer in a minute before we get there. I wanted to make sure we kind of tie a bow around this. Any other lessons that resonate with you that you can get from the story?
This is slightly off subject, but if any of you go to Jerusalem, if you go to the big hospital there, the Hadassah Medical Center, there is a chapel there, and that chapel has stained glass windows by Marc Chagall. And the windows are, each window is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And the Joseph window, though, it's in a bright yellow that just sort of irradiates beyond what the other windows do. But it's a spectacular thing to see when you get to Jerusalem.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
Since nobody else has said it, if life gives you liminality, work with God to make lemonade.
Thank you, Nelson, for that. We just had to spell lemonade differently, I suppose. Right, yeah, limeade, I guess. All right, Jack, if you would close us in prayer, please.
Friends, let's pray together. Loving God, come to us. Send your Holy Spirit upon us now, so that we may be the instruments of your divine purposes. Even in this place, even in this time, future unfolding before all of us. Your Son's name, we
Great, thank you all. Thank you for coming. Hope to see you next week. Young Evan is going to be our teacher with another Bible story. Oh, and if you could help us with this, because I'm.
let go of the mouse.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, anyone